There was a moment, and you remember it with the kind of precision that only discomfort produces, when you tried to reach him and something stopped you. Not a wall you could see, not a door you could knock on. Something more frustrating than that. The appearance of openness with the function of closure. He was sitting right there, looking at you, responding in complete sentences, and yet the distance between you felt like something measured in years rather than inches. You asked what was wrong? He said nothing was wrong? You said you could feel that something was off. He told you that you were overthinking. You pushed a little further, carefully, the way you had learned to do, not demanding, not accusing, just asking. And he looked at you with an expression that sat somewhere between patience and pity, and he said, "I just don't let external things affect me like that." And there it was, that sentence, that specific, particular, philosophically dressed sentence, delivered with the calm of a man who has decided that his emotional unavailability is actually a form of enlightenment. What he handed you in that moment was not honesty. It was a shield, ancient, borrowed, and aimed directly at the part of you that needed him to show up. And that shield has a name. My name is Marcus Aurelius, and I want you to learn to recognize the weapon before we discuss where it came from. Because it does not always announce itself. It rarely comes with the obvious markers of cruelty or indifference. In fact, the man who wields it most effectively is often the one who seems, by every external measure, like the more mature person in the room. He is calm when you are upset. He is rational when you are emotional. He does not raise his voice, does not make accusations, does not behave in any of the ways that culture has taught you to identify as problematic. What he does instead is quieter and more effective and significantly harder to name. He uses the language of self-mastery to justify the refusal of intimacy. I don't react to things I can't control. This is the sentence he produces when you tell him that his distance is hurting you. Reframing your need for connection as an external variable that a disciplined man should be able to ignore, which places the problem inside your nervous system rather than inside the relationship. I've worked through my emotions on my own. This one arrives when you ask why he never shares what he is actually experiencing, presenting his emotional self-sufficiency not as a limitation, but as an achievement, something he has earned through discipline. Something you should perhaps aspire to yourself. I'm not going to let this destabilize me. Said when a conversation becomes difficult, when you're asking for something real, when the interaction requires him to be present in a way that costs him something. And what it tells you, beneath the philosophical framing, is that your need for him to show up has been categorized as a threat to his stability rather than an invitation to connection. These are not random phrases. They form a coherent defensive system, and every woman who has spent time with this kind of man has heard variations of all three. What you need to understand is that behind this language is not a man who has genuinely transcended the need for emotional engagement. Behind it is a man who learned very early and very thoroughly that emotional engagement was dangerous, and who found at some point in his adult life a philosophical tradition that gave his avoidance a respectable name. I have to tell you something about my philosophy that most people who sell books with my name on the cover have not found it commercially useful to emphasize. I never taught this. What I wrote alone at night in a journal that was never intended for any audience was not a manual for becoming unreachable. It was the opposite. It was a man conducting a daily, rigorous, often painful examination of his own interior, because I believed, and still believe, that the unexamined life produces the kind of person who causes damage without understanding why, who moves through relationships, leaving behind a wreckage they cannot see because they have never looked clearly at themselves. When I wrote about controlling what is within our power and releasing what is not, I was describing the practice of directing one's energy wisely, not the practice of shutting down entirely and calling it virtue. But the Victorian Empire did not need wise men. It needed soldiers. In the second half of the 19th century, the British Empire covered a quarter of the surface of the earth, and sustaining that territory required men who could operate functionally, reliably, without psychological interruption, under conditions of sustained violence and loss. The public school system that processed English boys from the age of 8 was not designed to produce philosophers. It was designed to produce instruments, men whose emotional responses had been sufficiently suppressed that they could be directed without the complication of inner resistance. My name was borrowed for this project. The word Stoic was quietly redefined, stripped of everything I actually wrote about love, about self-knowledge, about the obligations of connection, and rebuilt into something that served the empire's requirements. Emotional restraint was repackaged as philosophical achievement. The boy who did not cry when he was sent away from his family at 8 years old was not understood as a child in pain learning to survive. He was held up as evidence that the training was working. That boy grew up. He had sons. His sons had sons. And the product of that inheritance, the man who sits across from you using philosophical language to justify his unavailability, is not behaving this way because he read Epictetus and found liberation. He is behaving this way because the system that produced him needed him to behave this way, gave him a respectable vocabulary for it, and never once asked him to examine whether the strength he was performing was actually strength at all. It was not strength. It was an empire's production requirement, dressed in the clothes of philosophy, passed down through generations of men who never knew they were wearing a uniform. Now I need to tell you the part that is hardest to hear, because it reframes the dynamic in a way that most relationship advice carefully avoids. The shield is not protecting him from pain. It is protecting his position. When a man uses Stoic language to close off emotional access, when he responds to your need for closeness with the calm, slightly superior demeanor of someone who has simply transcended the requirement for that kind of thing, the effect, regardless of his conscious intention, is to establish and maintain a specific power structure within the relationship. You are the one who needs. He is the one who does not. You are the one reaching. He is the one being reached for. You are the one making yourself vulnerable. He is the one who gets to decide whether and when to respond. This asymmetry is not accidental, and it does not resolve on its own, because here is what the dynamic produces over time. You work harder, you calibrate your approach, you soften your demands, you learn to ask for less because asking for less produces less withdrawal, and less withdrawal feels, in the economy of a relationship that has been running on scarcity, like abundance. You start to manage his emotional unavailability on his behalf, carrying the awareness of the distance so that he does not have to, maintaining the surface function of the relationship through the sheer effort of your own continued presence. And all the while, the philosophical framework gives him something that no amount of ordinary emotional unavailability could provide on its own: moral cover. He is not failing to show up. He is disciplined. He is not incapable of vulnerability. He has simply mastered his reactions. He is not leaving you alone in the relationship. He is demonstrating the Stoic virtue of self-sufficiency. He found in this philosophy not a path toward a better version of himself, but a mirror that reflected his avoidance back to him as achievement. That is what the shield protects, not his heart, his position. Let me be precise about what this looks like in practice, because the mechanism only works if you do not see it clearly. When you express that you need more emotional presence from him, the shield is deployed as a reframe of your need. You are too emotional, too reactive, too dependent on external validation, all of which are things he, through his superior self-development, has moved beyond. What this does is place the problem inside you, rather than inside the dynamic, which means that the solution, logically, is also inside you. You need to work on yourself, manage your expectations, become less affected by things you cannot control. You heard this and believed it, at least partially, because you are someone who takes seriously the possibility that you could be wrong, that you could be asking for too much, that your need for closeness might say something unflattering about your level of emotional development. And so you did the work, you read the books, you went to therapy, you examined yourself with the rigor and honesty that he performed but never actually practiced. And you came back to the relationship having genuinely grown, genuinely changed, genuinely more capable of tolerating discomfort. And the distance stayed exactly the same because the shield was never a diagnosis of your limitations. It was a strategy for maintaining his. Every time you accepted his framing, every time you concluded that the problem was your emotional reactivity rather than his emotional absence, you made the shield more effective and the relationship more unequal. Not because you were foolish, but because the language was sophisticated, the framing was plausible, and no one had handed you the tools to see through it. That is what this video is. Understanding the origin of the shield does not obligate you to stay in its range. This is the part that needs to be said plainly, without the softening that tends to accompany conversations about men and their psychological inheritances. Knowing that his unavailability comes from somewhere real and historically traceable does not mean that you are required to absorb its consequences indefinitely. Explanation is not absolution. Origin is not destiny. A man can carry a wound that was given to him before he had a choice, and still be responsible for whether he does anything about it. The question you should be asking now is not whether he has reasons for the shield. He does. The question is whether, knowing those reasons, he has made any genuine movement toward putting it down. Not the performance of movement, not the occasional conversation where he says the right things and then returns to the default distance within a week. Not the acknowledgement that he knows he should open up more, paired with zero evidence that this knowledge has changed anything. Actual movement, the willingness to be caught not knowing what he feels, the capacity to sit with your need for closeness without immediately converting it into a critique of your emotional regulation, the ability to be present in the relationship at a cost to himself. If that movement is there, it is worth something. If it is absent, if the shield has been in place for long enough that you have stopped noticing the weight of it, then what you have been calling love has been mostly your own labor, given to a man who found a philosophy that explained why he didn't have to give any back. You deserve better than that, not as comfort. As a statement of fact, I spent my reign trying to become the examined man, not the impervious one, not the one who had successfully sealed himself off from the needs and demands of human connection, but the one who looked clearly at what he was and asked every day whether he was becoming what he wanted to be. I failed regularly. The journal is full of the evidence, but I kept asking the question. And the question, I believed, was the point. The man who borrowed my name to stop asking questions, who found in Stoicism not a practice of rigorous self-examination, but a ready-made explanation for why rigorous self-examination was unnecessary, has not read me. He has read a version of me that was constructed by an empire to produce soldiers, refined by a self-help industry to produce customers, and deployed in your relationship to produce distance. Now you know what you were looking at. The shield was never about philosophy. It was about the fear of being seen by someone who was paying attention. You were paying attention. That was never the problem. The Examined Man. New essay every week. Subscribe. The Examined Man has nowhere left to hide.